Ethics Seminar 3, the 2nd of December 1959. Rereading the Entwurf, and Ethics is not psychology, how reality is constituted a topology of subjectivity. I have, up till now, taken account of a number of points in Freud's work, and last time you saw I was led in particular to refer to that curiously situated work, the Entwurf. You are aware of the reservations that one might have relative to the correspondence with Fries. It is not a work as such. The text we have is incomplete, but it is certainly extremely valuable and especially as supplementary material, among which the Entwurf has a special place. 1. The Entwurf is very revealing of a kind of substructure of Freud's thought. Its obvious relationship to all the formulations of his experience that Freud was led to offer subsequently makes it especially precious. What I have to say about it last time expressed well enough the way in which it will appear in my commentary this year. Contrary to received opinion, I believe that the opposition between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, or between primary process and secondary process, concerns not so much the fear of psychology as that of ethics, properly speaking. There was in Freud the perception of the proper dimension in which human action unfolds, and in the appearance of an ideal of mechanistic reduction acknowledged in the Entwurf, one should simply see a compensatory movement, or the other phase of Freud's discovery of the fact of neurosis, which is from the beginning seen in that ethical dimension, where it is, in effect, situated. The proof of this is in the fact that conflict is in the foreground, and that from the outset this conflict concerns the moral order in what we might call a massive way. That's not such a novelty. Every builder of an ethic has to face the same problem. It is insofar in this connection that it is interesting to write a history or a genealogy of morals, not in Nietzsche's sense, but a series of ethical systems, i.e. of theoretical reflections on moral experience. That way one understands the central significance of problems that have been posed since the beginning and that have been pursued with a notable constancy. After all, why is it necessary that thinkers in the field of ethics always return to the ethical problem of the relation of pleasure to the final good, whenever the guidance of human action from a moral point of view is concerned? Why do they always return to this same theme of pleasure? How does one explain the internal demand which constrains the ethical philosopher to try to reduce the antinomies associated with this theme? From the fact that pleasure appears in many cases to be the end which is in opposition to moral effort, but that the latter has nevertheless to locate its ultimate point of reference there, a point of reference to which the good that is supposed to orient human action is finally reduced. That's an example, and by no means the only one, of the kind of knot that which one comes upon in solutions to the problem. It is instructive for us to see the constancy with which the problem of conflict is posed within every discussion of morals. Freud in this respect appears as no more than a descendant, yet he contributes something unmatched in significance, something that has changed the problem of the ethical perspective for us to such a degree that we are not yet aware of. That is why we need reference points, and I have already alluded to some of those that we will need to take account of this year. One is to choose, since I don't intend to highlight all those writers who have discussed morals. I have discussed Aristotle because I believe that the Nicomachean Ethics is, properly speaking, the first book to be organized around the problem of an ethics. As you know, there are plenty of others around before and after and in Aristotle's work itself who focus primarily on the problem of pleasure. I will not be referring to Epictetus or Seneca here, but I will be discussing utilitarian theory insofar as it is significant for the new direction which culminated in Freud. I will indicate today the interest of the analysis I will be giving of certain works in the same terms that Freud used in the Entwurf when he designated something which, to my mind, at least, is close to the language that I've taught you over the years to pay attention to in the functioning of the primary process, namely Bahnung, or facilitation. As far as the statement of the problem of ethics is concerned, Freud's discourse facilitates something that allows us to go further than anyone has gone before in a domain that is essential to the problems of morality. That would be the inspiration for our discussion this year. It is around the term reality in the true meaning of the word, a term we always use in such a careless way, that the power of Freud's conception is situated. And it is a power that one can measure through the persistence of Freud's name in the development of our analytical activity. It is obvious that it is not the poor little contribution to a physiology of fantasy involved which explains the passionate interest we might take in reading the Entwurf. You will no doubt be told that this text is difficult, but it is also exciting, not so much in French as in German, for the French translation is extraordinarily awkward. It is wanting in precision, emphasis and resonance throughout. In brief, I am obliged to evoke or to provoke at this point the sense of regret some of you may have that you don't know German. In German it is a brilliant, pure text. It suggests a virgin source and is altogether remarkable. The outlines of the French translation obliterate that and make it grey. Make the effort to read it and you will realize how true my comment is, that one finds there something very different from a work constructed of hypotheses. It is Freud's first skirmish with that hyperbole of reality he had to deal with in his patients. There we have it. Around 40 years old, he discovers the true dimensions, the profoundly meaningful life of that reality. It is not out of a vain concern to refer you to a text that I draw your attention to the Entwurf. Why not, after all? You all know that on occasion I know how to take liberties with Freud's text and affirm my distance. If, for example, I have taught you the doctrine of the dominance of a signifier in a subject's unconscious chain, it is so as to emphasize certain characteristics of our experience. By virtue of a distinction that I don't fully agree with, a distinction that does nevertheless express something, the paper we heard last night called the above the experience of the content, and it affirmed in opposition to it the scaffolding of concepts. Now, this year I am proposing not simply to be faithful to the text of Freud and to be its exegete as if it were the source of an unchanging truth that was the model, mould and dress code to be imposed on all our experience. What are we going to do? We are going to look for the phylum and the development of the concepts in Freud. In the Entwurf in chapter 7 of the Traumdeutung, where he publishes for the first time the opposition between the primary and secondary processes and his conception of the relationship between the conscious, preconscious and unconscious. In the introduction of narcissism into this economy, then in what is called the second topic with its emphasis on the reciprocal functioning of the ego, the superego and the outside world, which gives complete expression to things that we may have glimpsed as shoots in the Entwurf. And finally, in the later texts that are still centred around the same theme, how is reality constituted for man, namely in the 1925 article on Verneinung, which we will look at again together, and in Civilization and its discontents, the discontents of man's situation in the world. The German term is Kultur, and we will perhaps try to define its exact meaning in Freud's writing. He never takes over concepts in a neutral, conventional sense. A concept is always for him a fully assumed significance. It turns out then that if we are following so closely the development of Freud's metapsychology this year, it is in order to uncover the traces of a theory that reflects an ethical thought. The latter is, in fact, at the centre of our work as analysts, however difficult it may be to realise it fully, and it is also the latter which holds together all those who constitute the analytic community. That dispersion, which often gives the impression of being a mere scattering of a fundamental intuition that is taken up by each of us from one perspective of another. If we always return to Freud, it is because he started out with an initial central intuition which is ethical in kind. I believe it essential to emphasize that if we are to understand our experience and animate it, and if we are not to lose our way and allow it to be degraded, that's the reason I'm tackling this subject this year. Last time I was pleased to hear an echo, a kind of response. Two of you who for reasons are involved in rereading the Entwurf, because they're working on a lexicon and perhaps for personal reasons, came to tell me after my seminar how happy they were with the way in which I had discussed Freud's text. It helped to justify the interest of their own rereading. I therefore had no difficulty remembering, it's something of which I am painfully aware, that this seminar is a seminar, and that it would be a good idea if it were not simply the signifier seminar alone that maintained its right to such a denomination. That is why I asked one of the two people to come and tell us the thoughts inspired in him by the way in which I related the subject of this seminar to the Entwurf. You will hear Jean-Bertrand Febvre-Pontalis and his colleague Jean Laplanche and he are currently working on top of the Entwurf, a work that, as Valbrega noted just now, you really have to have fresh in your memory if you are to say anything valid about it. Is that really true? I don't know, for one ends up realizing that it's not as complicated as all that. Lefebvre-Pontalis, there's a slight misunderstanding that I would like to clear up. I am by no means a specialist of the Entwurf, and I haven't reread it. I'm in the process of reading it. Dr. Lacan asked me to go over a number of points made in the seminar last week, including especially the question of the relation to reality that he described as particularly problematic, if not downright paradoxical, in this early text of Freud. Mr. Febvre-Pontalis' presentation followed. There is the French text of that, but I haven't recorded it in French either. 3. I would like to thank you for what you've done today. It will perhaps enable us to introduce this year a way of dividing up the seminar that will allow me to stop now and then and take a rest and at the same time have another use. It seems to me that you presented with remarkable elegance the vital armature of a problem where one risks getting lost in details that are, I must say, extraordinarily tempting. I did occasionally regret that you didn't enter the detail of the position of the Bahnung on the one hand and the Befriedigungserlebnis on the other. I also regretted that you didn't remind us of the topology that the systems phi, psi and omega presupposes. All that might perhaps have illuminated things, but it is clear that one could spend a whole term, indeed a year, simply in the attempts to rectify the distortions of certain of the Entwurf's original intuitions, distortions caused by the English translation. I notice an example of this more or less at random. Bahnung is translated into English by facilitation. It is obviously a word that has an exactly opposite meaning. Bahnung suggests the creation of a continuous way, a chain, and I even have the feeling that it can be related to the signifying chain insofar as Freud says that the development of the psi apparatus replaces simple quantity by quantity plus Bahnung, that is to say its articulation. The English translation facilitation slides over the thing. The French translation was modelled on the English text. As a result, all its mistakes have been multiplied, and there are even cases where its text is absolutely unintelligible compared to a simple German text. Nevertheless, I do believe that you emphasise the points that our following discussion will take up, discussions that will lead us back to the relationship between the reality principle and the pleasure principle. You show the paradox involved by indicating that the pleasure principle cannot be inscribed in a biological system. Yet, my goodness, the mystery isn't so great if we see that this state of affairs is supported in the following way, namely that the subject's experience of satisfaction is entirely dependent on the other, on the one whom Freud designates in a beautiful expression that you didn't emphasize, I am sorry to say, the Nebenmensch. I would have the opportunity to proffer a few quotations so as to show that it is through the intermediary of the Nebenmensch as speaking subject that everything that has to do with the thought processes is able to take shape in the subjectivity of the subject. I ask you to refer to the double column table that I drew for you the last time. This diagram will be of use to us until the end of our presentation and will enable us to conceive of the pleasure function and the reality function in a relationship that we will have to bind together more and more closely. If you approach them in another way, you end up with a paradox that you perhaps overemphasize today, namely that there is no plausible reason why reality should be heard and should end up prevailing. Experience proves it to be overabundant for the human species, which for the time being is not in danger of extinction. The prospect is exactly the opposite. Pleasure in the human economy is only ever articulated in a certain relationship to this point, which is no doubt always left empty, enigmatic, but which presents a certain relationship to what man takes to be reality. And it is through this that we manage to approach ever more closely that intuition, that apperception of reality which animates the whole development of Freud's thought. Freud posits that the psi system must always contain a certain level of Q eta quantity, which will play to the end an essential role. The discharge cannot in effect be complete, reach a zero level, after which the psychic apparatus achieves a final state of rest. The latter is certainly not the plausible goal or the end of the functioning of the pleasure principle. Freud wonders, therefore, and this is something that the translation misses, how one can justify that it is in such a level that the quantity which regulates everything is maintained. You perhaps skipped a little quickly over the reference to the psi system and the phi system. If the one is related to exogenous stimulations, it isn't enough to say that the other is related to endogenous stimulations. An important part of the psi system is in fact constituted of raw Q quantities from the outside, which are transformed into the quantities that are by no means comparable to those that characterize the psi system, among which the latter system organizes whatever reaches it from the outside, and does so in a way that is clearly expressed by Freud as apparently being similar to Fechner's theory. It is a matter of the transformation of what is pure and simple quantity into complication. Freud uses the same Latin term, complicationes. Thus we have the following scheme. On the one hand is the phi system, on the other is the psi system, which is a highly complex network capable of shrinkage and of Aufbau, that is to say, of extension. At this point of the theory, there occurs between the two a crossing over, which is indicated in Freud's little diagram. Once a certain limit is passed, that which arrives as quantity is completely transformed as far as its structure is concerned. This notion of structure, of Aufbau, is represented by Freud as essential. He distinguishes in the psi apparatus between its Aufbau, to retain quantity, and its function, which is to discharge it, die Funktion der Abfuhr. The function isn't simply to circulate and discharge, it appears at this level as split. One must realize that this apparatus is presented to us as isolated in a living being. It is the nervous system that is being studied and the totality of the organism. The latter is an extremely important point whose significance is to my mind obvious. It affirms and sustains itself in a very different way from the hypothesis that Freud evokes very nicely when he says that if one has a taste for them, one should only take them seriously once their arbitrary nature has been attenuated. Die Willkürlichkeit der Constructio ad hoc. It seems obvious to me that this apparatus is a topology of subjectivity insofar as it arises and is constructed on the surface of an organism. There is also in the psi system an important portion that Freud distinguishes from the part called the nucleus, the spinal neuronen, which are open to endogenous stimulation, a stimulation on the side where there is no apparatus transforming the quantities. One finds there a wealth of material that, given your wholly legitimate purpose to simplify, you failed to mention. By way of linking up to what I will have to say the next time, I will do so. There is, for example, the notion of Schlüssel neuronen, which have a certain function in relation to that part of the psi system which is turned towards endogeny, which receives its quantities. The Schlüsselneuronen are a particular form of discharge that occurs within the psi system. Yet paradoxically, that discharge has as its function to increase the pressure. He also calls these Schlüsselneuronen motorische Neuronen, and I don't think it's a mistake. They provoke stimulations that occur within the psi system, a series of movements which increase the tension still further and which, as a result, are at the origin of current neuroses. And this is a problem which has been particularly neglected and is for us of great interest. We will not go into that now, however. The important point is that everything that happens here offers the paradox of being in the same place as that in which the principle of articulation by the Bahnung reigns, the same place, too, in which the whole hallucinatory phenomenon of perception occurs, of that false reality to which, in brief, the human organism is predestined. It is again in the same place that the processes, oriented and dominated by reality, are unconsciously formed, insofar as it is a question of the subject finding the path to satisfaction. In this instance, satisfaction should not be confused with the pleasure principle. This is a topic that emerges, oddly enough, at the end of the third part of the text. You could not, of course, lead us right through such a rich text. When Freud sketches out what the normal functioning of the apparatus might represent, he speaks not of specific reaction, but of specific action as corresponding to satisfaction. There is a big system beyond that specifica action, for it can only correspond, in fact, to the refound object. We find here the foundation of the principle of repetition in Freud, and it is something we will have to come back to. That specific action will always be missing something. It is not distinguishable from what takes place when a motor reaction occurs, for it is, in effect, a reaction, a pure act, the discharge of an action. There is a very long passage that I will have occasion to come back to and to distill for you. There is no more vibrant commentary on the gap that is inherent in human experience, on the distance that is manifested in man between the articulation of a wish and what occurs when his desire sets out on the path of its realization. Freud expresses there the reason why there is always something that is far from finding satisfaction and which doesn't include the characteristics sought in a specific action. And he concludes with the words, I seem to remember that they are the last words of his paper, monotonous quality. Compared with anything that the subject seeks out, that which occurs in the domain of motor discharge always has a diminished character. We cannot avoid giving that remark the approbation of the most profound moral experience. By way of concluding these thoughts today, I will draw your attention to the analogy that exists between, on the one hand, that search for an archaic, one might say, a regressive quality of indefinable pleasure, which animates unconscious instinct as a whole, and on the other, that which is realized and satisfying in the fullest sense of senses, in the moral sense as such. That is far more than an analogy. It reaches a level of profundity which has perhaps never been articulated as such. End of Seminar 3, December the 2nd, 1959. Patrick Pearse and President John F. Kennedy. What makes Pearse such an essential element in trying to situate the position of Irish with regard to their language, and what has undergone a certain amnesia on the part of Pearse's friends as well as his enemies, is that it was this spirit of cultural rather than political nationalism that dominated almost his whole life. When Tom Kettle, a distinguished Home Ruler who was also to die in 1916 of the British Army in France, argued that national Irish political independence was indispensable, Pearse disagreed. The language movement is not merely more important than the political movement, but it is on a different and altogether higher plane. Political autonomy may be necessary to the continued existence of the nation. In the case of Ireland, it probably is, but it is not in itself an essential of nationality. What finally converted Pearse about 1912 to the Republican doctrine of physical force and gave rise to the spate of inflammatory articles and speeches by which he is best remembered is not our concern here, except to note that it was not part of the logic of the revival of the Irish language. Only a very tiny minority of Irish language enthusiasts accepted as necessary the link between the Irish language revival and the need for a violent separation from Britain. Whatever about his lifelong addiction to tales of the warlike exploits of Ireland's mythological heroes, and whatever sustenance he drew from those myths, when he was finally moved to fight, Pearse came very late to political action and even later to military action, and despite his title as President of the Provisional Government of Ireland, he was by no means the effective political or military leader of the Rising. What seems to have given him his extraordinary power over the Irish psyche, a power that was amplified through the magnificent poetry of William Butler Yeats, was that he became identified with the revival of Irish, and in a very real sense was less a martyr for Ireland than for the Irish language, which he saw as embodying the nation's soul. Tír gan teanga, tír gan anam, a country without a language is a country without a soul, was for the generations who followed him the epitome of Pearse's message. What he meant by the soul he tried to formulate in an article entitled The Spiritual Nation. When I was a child, I believed that there really was a woman called Éireann. This I no longer believe is a physical possibility, nor can I convince myself that a friend of mine is right in thinking that there is actually a mystical entity which is the soul of Ireland. But I believe that there is really a spiritual tradition which is the soul of Ireland, the thing which makes Ireland a living nation. The spiritual thing, which is the essential thing in nationality, would seem to reside chiefly in language, if by language we understand literature and folklore as well as sounds and idioms, and to be preserved chiefly by language. Pearse's goal was not simply the static preservation or the passive relearning of the tradition. He also wanted to transform Irish into a modern literary language. Along with an idealization of the Irish peasantry from whom his mother was descended, Pearse also inherited a very practical streak from his father, a free-thinking Englishman who had built up the biggest stonemasonry business in Ireland after pragmatically converting to the faith of his biggest customers, the Catholic clergy. He experimented with new forms of short story writing, set up a bilingual school much admired by educationalists, and produced a considerable body of translations of Irish prose and poetry. Even if his ultimate fate had been less romantically heroic, there is no doubt that his work would still entitle him to the place given him by the most contemporary critics as a founding father of modern Irish literary tradition. James Joyce, An Irish Stew. James Joyce's relationship to the Irish language has generally been seen by his biographers as having begun and ended in the spring of 1899, when the 17-year-old Joyce began to attend Irish classes given by the 19-year-old Pearse at the Jesuit University College in Dublin. Joyce, the story goes, found the earnest Pearse a bore and was so irritated by his habit of denigrating English in order to elevate Irish that he left after a few classes in order to study Ibsen's Norwegian. Critics have so stressed the poverty of his Irish library and his ignorance of Gaelic scholarship that it comes as a surprise to find Joyce's most recent biographer hinting at an interest in the activities of the Gaelic League that goes far beyond what is usually accepted. This is partly based on the census form of 1901 in which Joyce's father noted that James both spoke and wrote Irish, and on his previously unnoticed attendance at meetings of the League. Whatever about these newly discovered biographical details, Joyce's work provides ample evidence of his own, or his alter ego, Stephen Daedalus's, wrestling with the place the artist is to give to Irish. Part of this struggle had something to do with the realization that even for someone as remote from the Irish-speaking tradition as himself, although he was distantly related to Daniel O'Connell, the English language was still the language of the colonizer. This is vividly portrayed in his encounter with the Dean of Studies, who professes never to have heard the word tundish, which Stephen had used instead of the more usual funnel. The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. Tundish returns to haunt him as he prepares for his exile. I looked it up and find it English, and good blunt English too. Damn the Dean of Studies with his funnel. What did he come here for, to teach us his own language or to learn it from us? Damn him one way or another. The unease at speaking an English language which fails to capture something essentially Irish is reflected too in Ulysses. I speak the tongue of a race, the acme of whose mentality is the maxim, time is money, says the professor in the Alias chapter. When he made his first gramophone recording of his work, Joyce chose from the same chapter a speech defending the revival of the Irish language, comparing the attractions of English for the Irish to the seductions Egyptian civilization offer the Jews. But, ladies and gentlemen, Had the youthful Moses listened to and accepted that view of life, had he bowed his head and bowed his will and bowed his spirit before that arrogant admonition, he would never have brought the chosen people out of the house of bondage, nor followed the pillar of cloud by day. He would never have spoken with the eternal amid lightnings on Sinai's mountain top, nor ever have come down with the light of inspiration shining in his countenance and bearing in his arms the tables of the law, graven in the language of the outlaw. If this speech is, as some critics would have it, a statement of Joyce's artistic credo, it must seem that he acknowledges the efforts of the revivalists to bring the people out of bondage as being not dissimilar to his own. But to Joyce, the voice bidding him to be true to his country and help upraise her fallen language and tradition was just another seduction that he would have to resist. To it, as to the voice of his mother calling him back to the practice of religion, he ultimately would answer, "I will not serve." In the portrait, his friend Davin, who worshipped the sorrowful legend of Ireland and, like Pearse, had shaped his rude imagination by the broken lights of Irish myth, tries to win Stephen back to the Gaelic League and is scornfully rebuffed. "My ancestors threw off their language and took another," Stephen said. "They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject them. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life and person debts they made? When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets." The Ireland that Pearse and others saw as a lonely mother, on Cailleach Bera, calling her sons and daughters to vindicate her, Joyce saw as an old sow that eats her farrow. To wake from the nightmare of Irish history and be faithful to his calling as an artist involved physical flight from Ireland. But what he found was that the trip to Holyhead turned out to be the shortest way to Tara. The work that he fled Ireland to pursue could scarcely be defined in a more chauvinistic way: to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. In a curious way, Joyce seems to have been just as concerned about the essentials of Irishness as any of the Irish language revivalists. Yet rather than seeking it in the past, he saw it as a task to be accomplished by going forward to encounter the reality of experience. Not for him the Yeatsian attempt to remember the loveliness which had long faded from the world. I desire to press in my arms the loveliness which has not yet come into the world. Despite his rejection of any moral reading of his work, Joyce did seem to believe that the Irish soul could come to birth only if an Irish conscience could be forged. This perhaps is the rationale behind the creation of Leopold Bloom, an Irish Jew, a figure very far removed from the heroic saints and warriors who inflamed the imagination of Pearse and Yeats. Force, hatred, history, all that, that's not life for men and women, insult and hatred. And everyone knows that it's the very opposite of that is really life. Beckett was later to accuse Yeats of a flight from self-awareness. It is difficult not to address the same reproach to Pearse. But this is precisely the very Irish stew in which we still find ourselves. If we wish to go beyond the dominant utilitarian philosophy derived from O'Connell, must we try to find our place in the world in a dialogue with the unique tradition mediated by the Irish language, or can our conscience be satisfied with the deliberately non-heroic philosophy of Bloom? It is surely not for an Irish analyst to provide any generalized answer to this question. Without closing our minds to the social and political dimension of our task, I think our more modest aim is to be able to say with the heroes of Waiting for Godot, we have kept our appointments.